But zoning is, and don't forget it's on your screen here, zoning is the regulation of privately owned property for the benefit of public use. And we call that police powers. So zoning is part of the police powers, the things that the government has or the things that the government can do to limit what you can do with your property. Those police powers include things like zoning, master plan for growth of a city or community, building codes, and subdivision rules. Now, zoning is also a major part of what we call the government's master plan for growth. And think about this. A city is going to have a plan for growth because they need to make sure that some things happen. They need to make sure that there's separation between the different zoning classifications because we don't want a Clorox factory next to a residential subdivision. The other thing is we need to ensure that there is support services for those populated areas. So we need to make sure that as a city, we have grocery stores and gas stations co-located with or near population centers so the people that live there can get services such as grocery and gas. So the plan for growth or the master plan for growth that a city has is very important to its growth. And one of the ways that they ensure that is through these zoning processes. Now, zoning laws have a major impact on personal property. We've already talked about that, but here are some concepts that we have to know. So for example, zoning laws, they impact a property's setback. And a setback is basically the distance from a property line, a distance from a sidewalk or a curb, or even sometimes the distance from the middle of the street to an improvement on your individually privately owned property. So for example, you may have an 8-foot setback. That means that from the curb or from the sidewalk or from the middle of the street, depending on the specific zoning laws in a locality, a house could not be built or a house would have to be built 8 foot from a property or from a property line or 8 foot from a sidewalk. That would be considered a setback. Density is another area that zoning laws impact. Density is basically the number of homes that can be in a certain area or subdivision per acre. Buffers and buffer zones. Now, buffers are things like fences and tree lines that we separate things. Maybe we have a tree line that separates a community park from a residentially zoned subdivision. Buffer zones are dictated under zoning laws, and they are spaces between what we call use districts. So again, if we're going to have a commercially zoned area where there's grocery stores and restaurants and those type of things, and next to it is a residential single-family home subdivision, zoning laws is going to determine the criteria for the buffer zone. How long is it going, or how big is it going to be, and is there going to be tree lines or fence, those type of things. It also impacts the variance process, and we're going to talk more about that. And a variance process or a variance is simply an exception to zoning requirements. We'll talk more about that. Building heights. So in cities that have skyscrapers, how high can a building be? How high can a multifamily apartment be? How high can an office complex be? Something like that. And also commercial signage is another big one. Certainly, if you own a business, you want the biggest sign possible. However, zoning laws and zoning ordinances, there's going to be criteria on how big your publicly viewed sign for your business can and will be. And again, if you want to change that sign, so that the zoning laws are going to say your sign can only be this big, and if you want to request a bigger sign, then you would have to go through the variance process. Zoning categories. Here's another thing that you have to be aware of when we're talking about zoning. Now, typically, most jurisdictions have 5 or 6 different zoning categories. And I have them on your screen here. There's residential, there's office, commercial, industrial, agriculture, and special use purpose. Now, sometimes what they'll do, jurisdictions, they will put the special use purpose zoning category in one of the other categories, such as commercial or industrial. However, those are the 6 most common types of zoning categories. And notice that there is a capital letter next to each one. That's important because R represents residential zoning, O is for office, C is commercial, I is for industrial, A is for agriculture, and SP is typically the one that's for special use purposes. All right. Now it can go one step further. So we have certain areas zoned residential, for example. And then we're going to have a subcategory based on numeric values. So you're going to see R1, R2, R3, or Industrial 1, or I1, I2, I3. And those subcategories further determine the restrictions that are placed on that privately owned property within that category. So let me give you an example. Let's say that there's a plat it's zoned I for industrial. All right. So we have I1 and I2. I1 may be specific, or this property is specifically zoned I1, meaning it's only can be used for light industrial warehousing. If it's zoned I2, then it's for actual heavy manufacturing. We see the same thing in all the different categories. R1, for example, might have larger lots and bigger homes, where R9 is smaller, compacted, close together type housing units, and we typically see that in the older parts of town. Those type of things. And every jurisdiction has their own different categories and subcategories. And you notice on the bottom of your screen there, buffer zones. We discussed this a little bit earlier in the video, but buffer zones, and this is a key real estate term you have to know, it mandates the types and sizes determined by the zoning type and subcategories. So for example, you may have a buffer zone between 2 R1 zoned subdivisions. Well, that buffer zone is going to look a whole lot different than a buffer zone between a R1 residential and, let's say, I2, which is heavy manufacturing. The buffer zone could be a mile wide in that case versus a buffer zone between 2 R1 plots of land where it might only be 100-yard difference. So again, the buffer zones are determined by the types and sizes of the zoning. Changes in zoning. We need to know these concepts, and I've highlighted them here. Special use permit. Special use permit converts a property for a different use. So for example, we might have a homeowner who wishes to have a beauty salon in her home, or maybe someone wants to have a daycare. All right, so this property is zoned R1, but we're going to, instead of changing the zoning, we go down to the zoning board and we request through the variance process a special use permit. Now, typically special use permits are very distinct and direct for the type of usage. So in our case, we want a daycare. I want to run a in-home daycare. So I'm going to request a special use permit. And then it's going to require some type of inspection. And then ultimately there's going to be a time frame. So maybe it's a 3-year permit or a 2-year permit. So I'm allowed then, after the variance is approved by the zoning, the zoning committee, or maybe in a certain jurisdiction, it might be the city council, then I'm allowed for the next 1, 2, or 3 years to have a daycare inside my house. That's a special use permit. Notice we're not changing the zoning. We're only getting a permit to temporarily change its use. Conditional use permit. Now, this is another type of permit, and it's something that is beneficial to the general public. So for example, maybe you want to put a sandwich shop in an I2 zoned area, an industrial zone 2, which is heavy manufacturing. Now, it's very inconsistent with one another, the sandwich shop and the Clorox factory, but that Clorox factory has hundreds potentially of employees working all 3 shifts. So that sandwich shop is going to be there to support the workers in that industrial complex. Again, we're not changing the zoning for this sandwich shop. We're asking for a permit. Exclusionary zoning. Exclusionary zoning is basically larger residential lots, typically 5 to 10 acres 10-acre plots. Inclusionary zoning is a concept where it is zoning, so it's permanent, but it requires low-income properties to be included in new housing divisions or developments. Inclusionary zoning. Nonconforming use. This is where what we call grandfathered zoning or grandfathered properties. And what that means is the current use of this property is in violation. However, or the current use of the property is in violation of current zoning laws. However, when the property was first zoned many decades ago, it was lawful. So let me give you an example. Maybe there is a grocery store that's zoned commercial on the very edge of town. Remember, at the time that the grocery store was built, it was built on the edge of town. And since then, the plan of growth and the city has grown around it, and it's now actually the whole area is zoned residential. However, that store still exists. And so even though it was zoned commercial, that area is now residential. So it is grandfathered in and it is allowed to continue to be a grocery store. That is non-conforming use. Spot zoning is very isolated and individual to specific properties. And it's a request for an activity outside the current allowable activities. Now, the difference between nonconforming use and spot zoning, it's important to know. Nonconforming use is it was originally zoned one way, and then through time in history or through the time or over time, the surrounding area developed and then the zoning was changed. But it's grandfathered in. Spot zoning is where we're making an exception. So let me give you an example. Maybe there is a vacant lot in a subdivision that is completely zoned for single-family houses, but it's been a nuisance to the city. People dump their garbage there, and so a developer comes along and says, listen, I'll buy this property. However, I want to change the zoning or spot zoning so I can put a duplex or a fourplex there, which is still residential, but it's considered multifamily. And because it does benefit the city or the community, they're going to allow it. That is called spot zoning. It's very isolated in nature. Down zoning is another concept where the property is rezoned to a lower use. So maybe we're going from R9 to R1, or we're going from office to residential, something like that. It's being down zoned. And then the variance, we've talked a lot about that. A variance basically is an official request by the owner that needs an exception to current zoning requirements. Maybe you need your setback on your property is 8 feet, but you want to put a 2-car garage on the property, and you're going to need it's going to encroach onto that property or that setback by 2 feet. So you're going to go in and ask the zoning board for a variance. Or maybe you want to increase the sign of your or you want to increase the size of your sign in front of your commercial building by 25%. That would require a variance. And the process is the legal process for that change. Now that's zoning from A to Z. If you have any questions about zoning or you're unclear on anything, please, down in the comment section, leave your comment or question, and I do return with answers to those. If you're going to continue studying, check out this video to my left. If you have not subscribed to this YouTube channel, I would appreciate it. Click the little circle to my left. I would appreciate that as well. I'll see you in the next video.